Hey everyone, it's Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest discussions that have happened in 2023 for paleontology. And these range from just individual papers all the way up into entire subjects that had a lot of papers written about them. Let's get started. In my opinion, one of the most important papers of 2023 came out in December, and it has the potential to be much more interesting as more researchers start to use this kind of method and this kind of specific framework that was made for this paper. Because it was looking at the end-Triassic extinction. So the Triassic into the Jurassic, which is a very odd mass extinction. This is largely because the mass extinction at the end of the Triassic acted differently on land and in the water. In the water, the ecosystem seemed mostly still somewhat stable. Meanwhile, on land, it seemed like there's a lot of turnover where suddenly very large, important niches actually just died out and then were fairly rapidly replaced still, but very different from what we see in the ocean. So what these researchers did is essentially made a framework that has been used for aquatic extinctions before, where essentially you just, hey, map out the ecospace and have all these little blocks that indicate, hey, is the animal on the bottom? Is it swimming? Is it a filter feeder? Is it an active predator? What is it doing? And they essentially made one of those for the land. Now, how accurate it exactly is going to take more study, and that's part of what I'm really excited for the future. However, with this at least initial emphasis on the framework, they were able to show that, hey, when you're looking on land, there's a lot of niches that are filled by basically one, maybe two animals, which means if one of those species dies out, you're at 0 to 50% of that niche still being filled. Meanwhile, in the water, there's a lot of things, for example, that are hanging out on the bottom of the seafloor filter feeding. So if one of those goes extinct, there's still plenty of other organisms to still fill in part of that niche and support a healthier ecosystem. Staying in the Triassic, there was also Funcusvermis, or the world's oldest known caecilian. The caecilians, or Gymnophonia, are these really weird worm-like amphibians, and they mostly spend their lives underground, so it's really hard to study them even in the modern day. This new fossil, though, was found from microfossils, meaning they essentially sifted out the sediment and found little fragments of bone and went, hey, we can connect those two and start building some of the parts of this organism. What they were able to tell from this is actually a number of really interesting things. The first is mostly just to do with range because modern-day caecilians are basically equatorial, and this fossil coming from the Triassic beds of northern Arizona and petrified forest actually are from what would have been the equator around 220 million years ago. So it seems like the caecilians evolved at the equator and then kind of just stuck there. More importantly, though, it helps us to understand where the amphibians actually evolved from. Because amphibians kind of suck for this. It's kind of like, hey, we have no frogs or salamanders, and then suddenly we have frogs and salamanders. So it's really hard to say exactly where they evolved from. We, at the same time, also have caecilians, and those groups aren't directly related to one another. They're still closely related, but not necessarily directly related. Which means potentially that when we're looking at the kind of stem amphibians, the temnospondyls, there was a chance that the caecilians could have evolved out of an entirely different lineage from the batrachomorphs, that is, salamanders and frogs. This paper, though, is able to really put those two closer together and say, actually, all modern amphibians, that is, Lissamphibia, seemingly evolved from Dicerophoids. And part of that is because of some traits found in Funcusvermis. Specifically things like pediculate teeth, which just means essentially there's this weird bald area, essentially, where there's not an enamel, but then there is an enamel up on the top, as well as other traits like having a large orbit. This is something we see in the Dicerophoids, and while modern-day caecilians don't have large eyes because they're mostly underground, it really helps to show that at least early on they did, and that there was some really important traits in that eye socket that really helped us to be able to say, hey, this is a Dicerophoid, this is where amphibians evolved from, we understand some of their evolution now, finally. There's also been a suggestion that the Lagiripitids are the closest relatives to the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic. And there's been a few different reasons to try and suggest this, including certain traits in the femur. However, before this, it was often suggested that Scleromochlus was the closest relative to the pterosaurs. So what's the next logical step? Study Scleromochlus more and see how it fits into the Lagiripitids. Scleromochlus has been really hard to study historically because we don't actually have the bones. Instead, what we have is where the sand dune essentially collapsed on top of the body, and then the bones dissolved away just because there was acidic water or something like that moving through it. So we just have these voids where the bones would have been. This has made it really hard to study because this rock is also pretty fragile, so you can't make a peel of it and go, hey, look at all these nice bones that are preserved in it. Instead, what we've actually needed is modern technology, specifically micro-CT scanning, which has been able to show a lot of great features, like, hey, it would have had a really, really long tail. It also would have been deeper body than a lot of the earlier reconstructions show. With this study getting a better idea of Scleromochlus' anatomy, they were able to actually find it as the earliest diverging lagiripitid, so very close to that base where the lagiripitids and things like the pterosaurs actually split from one another. There were also micro-CT scans of the braincase of Dromomeron, another type of lagiripitid. And this one's actually really interesting because what they found is it had very enlarged vestibular systems. That is the canals in the ear that help you know your balance. Essentially, there's fluid that moves around in these three canals. So if you turn your head like this, the fluid flows one way and it tells you, hey, your head's sideways. And that's how that system works in order for an organism to actually understand its body position. This is really similar to what we see in pterosaur braincases. So it seems like Dromomeron and likely the other lagiripitids, very few of them have been scanned in this way, really were pretty similar to the pterosaurs. And that includes in parts of their brain anatomy that then the pterosaurs were able to, since they would have already had that, take to the next step as they started to learn how to fly. But arguably the most interesting convergence between the lagiripitids and the pterosaurs from the last year is in Venetoraptor, for a number of reasons. First off, it would have had a beak, which helps to show that the pterosaurs and the dinosaurs would have evolved among very diverse cast of very different animals that were doing different things with their bodies. However, more importantly for the pterosaur part is the fourth finger on Venetoraptor's hand, which was enlarged. This seems pretty minor, and it actually lost the fifth finger. That's just something that happens evolutionarily pretty often. However, the fourth finger is what supports the wing in pterosaurs, meaning essentially this potentially could indicate that the pterosaurs might have, rather than being the sister group to the lagiripitids, just evolved directly out of them. And that's still going to be really hard to say for sure. There would have been pterosaurs around at the same time as Venetoraptor was found, or at least very close to it, so we don't know exactly how closely related Venetoraptor would have been to the pterosaurs when compared to all of the rest of the lagiripitids. Still, really interesting find. But the beginning of the Triassic was also really important for the oceans because a lot of new life forms evolved that were able to use the oceans in different ways. And that includes just basic things like reefs. Before the Triassic in the Permian and even again all the way back to the Cambrian, you have very different reef systems, largely dominated by things like brachiopods, rugose corals, which were mostly solitary, tabulate corals, which aren't closely related to modern-day corals, and other things like crinoids, which are still around today, but not nearly in the same kinds of numbers. A new fossil site coming from China just a few million years after the extinction, though, shows what basically seems like an almost modern reef system. And that's going to be things like scleractinian corals, more bivalves than brachiopods, and even just sharks instead of things like the chimeras, which are related to sharks but not sharks. And it's not a perfect one-to-one match. There are some things that are different, like having ammonites, which are extinct now, and there's still plenty of coelacanths around, which there's not today, but there's still other groups that are also evolving at this time, things like lobsters and shrimp. And we find those kinds of fossils in this site, so it really may have been the first truly modern, at least loosely modern, ecosystem in the oceans, or at least reef system in the oceans. And those kinds of reef systems would start to develop even more complex relationships, especially as vertebrates started to move more and more into the aquatic systems. And this is shown by another site in China from about 2 million years after the previous site that was early on dominated by things like Nothosaurs. They would have looked kind of like plesiosaurs, but would have still had actual limbs as opposed to flippers. And this is really interesting because just after this period, about 1 million years after it, it seems like there was this sudden shift in the fauna, where you go from Nothosaur dominated to things like plesiosaurs, or at least pistosaurs, which would lead to the plesiosaurs, and ichthyosaurs being the large carnivores and largest animals in these ecosystems. So pretty rapidly after that extinction at the Permian-Triassic boundary, there was suddenly just this great wealth of different organisms moving into the water. And these organisms were doing great early on. In fact, a handful of ichthyosaur vertebra from Svalbard, an island off the coast of Norway, are actually really good at showing this because they're large. And that means this ichthyosaur, while not named because it's just a handful of vertebra, would have also been large and from very close to that extinction, the Permian-Triassic extinction. In fact, it's so close to that boundary that it suggests that potentially ichthyosaurs evolved before the Permian-Triassic extinction and were able to just survive through it and then go around and just flourish immediately after that extinction. But not all of the ichthyosaurs were large. There were also things like Hupehsuchus, which was exceedingly bizarre and actually convergent on animals that were much larger. And that's because Hupehsuchus would have been about 1 meter long or around 3 feet. Meanwhile, large parts of its skull anatomy are very convergent on whales, specifically baleen whales that do filter feeding. So it seems like Hupehsuchus, while much smaller, would have been hanging around some lagoons in China and doing the same thing, filter feeding for small organisms that would have been floating in the water. On the subject of whales, though, the baleen whales may not have been the largest organisms to ever be on the planet, and that's because of the new find of Perucetus, an even older whale even before baleen whales started to evolve, but very importantly, very heavy boned. And by that I mean you can just compare its vertebrae to those of things like the blue whale, where you can see it's just much more chonky. And what that means is it was probably heavier bodied and potentially even heavier than a blue whale. Now the fossil's not super complete, and the rest of it may actually just be under 20 tons of soil in a hill, which is going to be really hard to try and get out of there because 20 tons of soil is a lot of soil. However, again, really important for understanding, whales were super weird even very early on. And they weren't all massive though. In fact, another basilosaurid from the same month, Tutcetus, was found to be the smallest basilosaurid, a group of the very early whales. These two whales together help to show just how diverse early whales were. They weren't all just kind of converging on just a single life plan. Instead, they had many different life plans, including some that were very small-bodied and some that were very large-bodied. On the subject of the basilosaurids having many life plans but not being directly related to modern whales, we have one that's a little bit closer, Olympicetus, which also not directly related to modern whales, but it has a tooth count very similar to the basilosaurs. However, it also has skull morphology which suggests it may have had a melon, the organ used for echolocation, and only shows up in later whales, meaning that potentially Olympicetus is this great kind of transitional fossil between very early whales in the ocean and our more modern type whales. And then there's kind of the oddball groups of whales, which the first one is the Xenorophus, which aren't that extreme. They're honestly kind of dolphin-like. And it was found that Xenorophus would have been one of the largest species of the Xenorophids, and it actually would have been about the size of a spinner dolphin, so they weren't exactly massive whales, not even as large as things like bottlenose dolphins. A new species of Xenorophus was described this past year and really helps to highlight that they were diverse. However, this group has also only been found on the Carolinas and Virginia, so it seems like they were very highly specialized to just that region, and while still diverse, certainly weren't going around the entire world the way modern dolphins have. The others were oddly toothed whales from New Zealand, and by oddly toothed, I mean the teeth stuck out of their jaws. Nihoroa and Nihoroa are the two newly named genera, and they likely use their procumbent, or at least extruding, pointed out teeth to try and slash at prey. This is very similar to what we see in things like modern day sawfish, and it was probably doing something similar. Unfortunately, we really don't have the biomechanics studies to say that for sure, but it is at least suggestive of that kind of trait evolving in the dolphins and or whales at least once. It's very strange. And hopefully there will be some more biomechanical studies done on this in the future, and it sounds like a great graduate project if you're into that kind of thing. Staying in the oceans, Dunkleosteus also got shrunk, and this is jumping way back to the Devonian, right around the time plants were first moving onto land, which I will discuss here in a minute. But for Dunkleosteus, it was thought to be a 30-foot long or around 10-meter long placoderm fish, and it would have been the apex predator in its time. This estimate of 30 feet was actually based on similar related placoderms, but they had seemingly a different body plan, and by that I mean they were somewhat more eel-like. Future studies have suggested that it would have been more shark-like in its body plan with an actual, lobed fin, top and bottom lobes, and big dorsal fin on the back. This paper, though, wasn't necessarily worried about the exact body shape, but rather the body length. And they did this by not necessarily just going, hey, its mouth was this big, therefore it must have been 30 feet long, but instead using actual measurements, specifically from the orbit to the back of the operculum. This is the bony covering you see in modern-day fish that actually covers the gills. By measuring this length in a lot of different fish, as well as their total length, including some fossil placoderms, the researcher was able to go, hey, this all lines up much more consistently. And that also means Dunkleosteus, for which we mostly just have the head shield, those kind of very bony head plates, probably wasn't 30 feet long. Instead, it was probably closer to 12 feet long, or around 4 meters. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't terrifying. It's still a 12-foot long fish with giant shearing jaws. Some people are upset that they shrunk it because, I don't know, they want it to be big and dramatic, I guess. It can still be terrifying without being 30 feet long. And as for the foreshadowing about plants moving onto land during the Devonian, they're probably the reason things like Dunkleosteus went extinct, and this study was able to do that by looking at many sediments and finding different chemicals in them, specifically phosphorus. This is because as land plants moved onto land, they would have actually started adding more soils to the surface, but that also means more erosion, including of things like phosphorus. Phosphorus is good for life in some quantities, however if there's too much of it, it will bind to oxygen and there will essentially be anoxia. There won't be enough oxygen in the water for different organisms to survive. This caused a mass extinction because as there's not oxygen for things to actually survive in, they're going to die out. And there wasn't exactly a lot of life on land at this time, especially animal life. So this was the cause of one of the mass extinctions because there wasn't life on land trying to balance it out, and the oceans just absolutely suffered because there wasn't oxygen. But the first plants on land weren't necessarily what you might think of when you're thinking of land plants, specifically trees and especially fruiting trees. Those are those that produce flowers and fruits or seeds in that kind of manner, as opposed to having seed-bearing cones, the way you see in things like cycads and pine trees. Fruiting trees are called angiosperms, and now there's a new fossil coming from the Middle Jurassic, Fructus, which helps to suggest that very early on they were still evolving, or at least earlier than previously thought. Genetic research suggests that modern-day angiosperms started diverging from each other during the early Cretaceous, and this would have been many millions of years after the Middle Jurassic. However, some of that same genetic data suggests some of them may have started branching off even earlier, around the Middle Jurassic potentially. What this means is Fructus actually really helps to fill in this kind of gap that we don't really understand about angiosperm evolution. And the thing is, there was a lot of work done on angiosperm evolution this year. This includes with one study that essentially just very quickly and easily wrote, hey, all of these angiosperm plants, based on the fossils we have of them, seem like they were more diverse very early on in their evolution, whereas nowadays there's just a more consistent spread of flower types and shapes. Now there could be bias here because the fossil record isn't super complete, so it could make it seem like there's these more diverse groups than there actually would have been. However, even finding some fossils that belong to modern groups, you can see they're not exactly like modern groups. For example, you can look at the fossil lotus Nothosaurus, which doesn't have the distinct, beautiful flower shape that we expect of modern lotuses. Instead, it would have been pretty different. That's really important for understanding how it would have actually began to evolve for different pollinators to actually come in and pollinate different flowers. Additional new fossils of angiosperm trees from the late Cretaceous also helped to show that they weren't necessarily just pushed to the wayside by the more common gymnosperms at that time. And that's because, at least in this location in the Czech Republic, the angiosperms were actually more common, and they were making large, complex forests. There are other areas that need plant fossil studies, though, including Southeast Asia, which there's been a lot of new work in Southeast Asia, just not on plants, and this spans a very large time frame, from some of the earliest trilobites in the Cambrian and Ordovician all the way up to almost the modern day. Starting with the trilobites, there were 10 new species of trilobites named coming from Thailand. They come from the Tarutao group, which would have been deposited off the coast of what would become Australia during the Cambrian and into the Ordovician around 500 million years ago. Now there's already over 20,000 species of trilobites that have been named, so I'm not necessarily going to speak to the importance of these ones because I'm not a trilobite expert. I will wait for trilobite experts to make their own comments on it. But this is really cool to see these fossils being found, and it really helps to show that there's still really cool fossils to find in places that haven't been as heavily explored for paleontology. But if trilobites don't do it for you, there's always dinosaurs, like Minimocursor, which is a new ornithischian ornithopod dinosaur coming from also Thailand. And it would have been around in the Cretaceous and seems like it was a fairly early branching of the ornithopods. It would have been close to the sauropods, which includes things like the ceratopsians, but also the hadrosaurs. However, not necessarily directly in that group. It's not as complete as it would like to be, but it is still fairly complete, especially the leg material. What this means is that there's really good evidence that we should keep looking for fossils in Thailand. We might find more complete things and be able to understand what was happening in this part of the world around 120 million years ago. It's not all Thailand though, because there was also the first ever dinosaur fossil found in Cambodia. Now it's just a single limb bone from a sauropod, specifically a euhelopodid, which means it was probably a brachiosaurus-like animal. It could have potentially also been more like a titanosaur, where they would have been more horizontal than vertical, but still very large-bodied sauropods in this part of Cambodia. And returning to Thailand, there was also the discovery of a new species of alligator, Alligator munensis. And this is interesting because it implies that at least at one point there was a range of alligators going from Thailand all the way up to where the modern day Chinese alligator lives. And those are now extinct, but potentially there's more fossils out there. I will say this is about 170,000 years old, but there are some error bars there. but because of the horizon of soil it was found in, it's possible it could be a few tens of thousands of years younger or older. But that's the best guess we have for now, at least. One thing researchers may need to do in those parts of the world, though, is actually use new methods to try and find fossils. That's because trees are really dense. All of this green stuff covers up the rocks where you want to find the fossils in. So new methods might be necessary. And there have been some people doing new methods, not necessarily in rainforests, but in the Ica Desert, specifically in the Pisco Formation. And that's because many of the fossils there are actually covered in dolomite, which is a harder mineral than the rest of the matrix and the mudstone that surrounds them. What this means is researchers were able to fly over parts of the Pisco Formation with ground-penetrating radar, which is just radar that goes through the ground, and we're able to see where different dolomite blocks are, and from that be able to more accurately predict where fossils might be, which makes finding fossils much easier, especially when you're in a very harsh environment and you need to pour all your own water in. It's a lot easier to know where you're going and bring maybe a week's worth of water because you don't need to bring a whole month's worth and hope you find something. But then there's even higher tech methods being used, including using a particle accelerator, which is what some Japanese researchers did. They took some limb bones, probably from Funcusvermis, and put them into this particle accelerator. This might seem really strange, but particle accelerators are able to make very, very high frequency, that's very, very small X-rays. And they're so small, in fact, that you could see all of these little lines and details from inside the bone of this supposedly Funcusvermis. If you followed paleontology research for a while, this part should look familiar to you, because it's very similar to what researchers have been doing when they cut open bones, turn them into thin sections, and then look at them in a microscope to find LAGs, or lines of arrested growth. Essentially, where an animal slowed down its growth so we can see what its kind of growth rate was on a yearly basis. What they did then after they put these fossils into the synchrotron is they did that. They cut open the bone and were able to look and make these kinds of thin sections and go, hey, this is a really accurate picture of what's happening inside the bone. So potentially we don't actually need to use destructive methods to understand the growth rate of certain dinosaurs. We just need more synchrotron time, I guess. Other technologies have also been used for a while in paleontology, and that includes scanning electron microscopes. And I say scanning electron microscopes because they're very good at finding things like melanosomes, which, when you compare the shape of the melanosome to modern-day melanosomes in living birds, you can say something about the potential color of different dinosaurs. But there's another entire question there, especially when we're looking at feathers, is there a bias in which feathers get preserved? Two teams of researchers use similar methods for this of putting a feather in some mud and compressing it and heating it to a very large degree. The first team found that the amount of melanin has a very high importance for how well the fossil feather is preserved. This is especially true for just how precisely the feather is preserved, and you can see that in the different lab samples that were all put under this kind of pressure. Another team, though, rather than looking at the preservation quality of the feather itself, was looking more at the chemical data that would be present there. And what they found is phyomelanin really resistant, which means when we're looking at certain feather types, specifically more ruddy to reddish feathers, it seems like they're more likely to be preserved because the phyomelanin is more stable, whereas other types of melanin are less stable. What this means is there could very well be a bias where we're seeing more ruddy type melanosomes than that otherwise exist in the organism. Not because they were actually more red or anything's changing, just those are the ones that survive. But having red crest the way Ancient did based on the fossils we have of it isn't the only way dinosaurs could have communicated. In fact, a new fossil of Pinacosaurus still has the larynx preserved, that is, the voice box, and it's more complex than would have been thought. This means it probably could have produced some more complex sounds, things like whistles, as opposed to just hissing and bellowing the way modern-day alligators do. Now, the larynx still isn't as complex as a modern bird's syrinx, which actually splits up to both lungs so they can make two sounds at once. That's what lets things like song sparrows be very complex in their calls. But it does suggest that things like Pinacosaurus, which is not very closely related to birds at all, could have still been doing very complex calls and using some of those calls in display or communication within its species. But there was still more with ankylosaurs, specifically their nasal passages. And this is in the soft tissue section of the video, but it's not really soft tissue because there were bones growing in its nasal passages. This seems a little odd, but it's actually really good for understanding potentially what its lifestyle was. And that's because these kinds of bones came from an infection that probably would have come from one of two sources. Either A, some sort of predator was trying to hunt it and didn't succeed, meaning that this tarchia was able to escape and then slowly grow bone growths in its nose until it died from a combination of infection and not being able to breathe through half of its nose. Really rough way to go. The alternative and the idea I like more is that it got this injury from fighting with other tarchia. There's been really good evidence for ankylosaurs not necessarily using their tails to fight off predators primarily, but mostly for fighting one another, which is really interesting and potentially just got bonked on the nose during some sort of mating display or territorial fight, and then died a few months later. And as for the final paper on soft tissues, it still has to do with the head, but specifically, did dinosaurs have lips? And this doesn't mean they were necessarily able to whistle like you and me. These aren't highly mobile lips that you see in mammals, but rather just the basic covering that you see in things like lizards. There's a reason their teeth don't show when their mouths are closed, and that's because they have lips. By comparing modern-day crocodilians, which don't have lips, to other animals that do have lips, and especially other reptiles that have lips, it was found that those that do have lips have a lot of foramina in the skull along the jawline, and essentially those would provide blood and nerves to different parts of the face. This implies there's some sort of fleshy structure there with which to feel, for example, lips. So this is a really solid piece of evidence that these animals did have lips, and likely many of the early crocodilomorphs that lived on land still would have had lips. It seems like crocodilians actually mostly lost their lips once they moved to the water. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. It's been a big year. There was a lot of stuff I had to cut. If your favorite paper of the year was cut, I apologize, but there was a lot going on. If this is your first video with us, we do monthly reviews where we talk about what are some of the biggest papers that came out that month, and it can be papers that are big and famous, like the T-Rex lips one, or it can be something as small as growth rates in different brachiopods, because that's still very important for us for understanding how different methods work in the fossil record. And I really try and cover a broad swath of topics to do that. So feel free to subscribe, or if you want to support the channel more directly, check out our Patreon. With all of that said, everyone, be safe, take care, don't go extinct.